Okay. All right. So let's talk really quickly about kind of what the next little bit is going to look like. I guess I should probably make this smaller. Oh, your dog died? Whose dog died? I'm so sorry. Okay. Anyways, I hope whoever's dog died is okay. We're gonna go into that. Oh, it was a joke? Oh, okay. I was gonna say. Anyways, so let me talk really quickly about what we can expect and things like that over the next couple of days. So, oh, by the way, I put this here really quickly for the access code. So we don't have any access codes. We'll have an access code next class, but not this class. And that'll be your access code for the test that is going to be next week, which really is just a practice DBQ. It can be rewritten for 100%. So don't necessarily think it get like really, really scared of a test and things like that. So I hope that you guys all read my changes to due dates, and I really, really hope that this kind of lessens the stress for everybody. Fingers crossed. So today we have our lecture that I'll talk about in just a second. Then you have your practice quiz, which is all the way from Monday's lecture. So hopefully that's had enough time for you to be able to do that. Tomorrow your DBQ is due. And again, Miles, be very, very careful. We really need to be careful on today's lecture, so just be aware of that. And then Monday, Wednesday, you guys don't have anything, so you can hopefully catch up on all this other stuff. And then Tuesday, we have a lecture on general foreign policy. This is going to be more Cold War stuff compared to today's lecture, which is really solely on the Middle East. Then you have a practice quiz. I made all the assignments. This is another one that's been pushed back. This is all being pushed back to next Friday. So hopefully these two assignments you've now had a month to do. The mock DBQ, which I'm saying is a test, but it can be rewritten for 100%. And then let me explain really quickly this next Thursday. And I do appreciate the chat is much nicer to me today than it was last time. So I think I'm doing something good. So that's great. Really quickly about this lecture next Thursday. So at 12:15, we will have a lecture. It's going to be about 20 to 30 minutes long. I'm going to introduce you to review, suggestions for a review book, give you an outline of how we're going to review for the AP exam, which is about 1 month minus a single day from next Thursday. The AP exam is 1 month from Wednesday, to give you a little bit of an idea of what's coming up in terms of the AP exam. So this will only be about 15 to 20 minutes. And then here's some extra credit for you guys. I know a lot of you guys have been wanting extra credit. You may not have been getting the scores you've been wanting on the FRQ practice quizzes, which, by the way, I have to adjust the weights on it. So those will be adjusted, and I'll let you know when the grades are official. I'm almost done with the FRQs. I'm just a little bit short because this PowerPoint took me 8 hours. So anyways, so we are then going to have 2 optional lectures. One is on domestic policy, so everything going on in America. This is at the exact same time as our normal lecture and should end at a normal ending of the lecture time. And then at 3:30 for fun, we're going to have a pop culture all about the craziness of the 80s, 90s, 2000s, what pop culture has been influenced on and all these different things like that. Now, the benefit of attending these optional ones is extra credit. So I will have an extra credit quiz that will go online that you will have to be able to answer to me questions from those optional lectures, and then you'll receive extra credit. Does everybody kind of understand what I mean by these optional? This one on domestic policy is the most important one because it is going over a lot. And then you have the pop culture. Those lectures will be recorded. You are correct. They will be recorded. And then probably Friday, I'll release those and you'll have like a week to be able to do it or something along those lines. But these 2 will be recorded. The domestic policy is probably the most impactful one if you want to know like American history. Okay. Anybody else have any questions about outlines? Okay. Hopefully this de-stress you guys. I don't know what the extra credit's going to look like yet. I'll be honest with you. I haven't decided what it's going to look like. I have to make it into a way where you can't cheat on it. So I just have to, it'll be far easier though than a normal FRQ quiz. So it is not going to be give me a HIP analysis. It's not going to be anything like that. It is probably going to be short answer questions where I'm asking your opinion on a topic, and then you have to support those. So for example, today, a topic could have been something like, should we have gone to war after 9/11? And then tell me your evidence behind that. I don't know how much extra credit yet, but normally it's probably going to be the same amount that I normally give people, which usually boosts people up 2 to 3 letter grades depending on how much they get correct. Okay.
That's right.
Yes.
Is the class calendar, like with the due dates and stuff on Canvas, is that all the way updated?
I'll update it today.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm a little behind on it. I updated it the other day, but I changed a lot of things last night. So this whole idea, when I saw how many things people wanted to talk about, that's what, actually, Miles, I disagree with you, but again, we will talk about that. Okay, Miles, I will boot you if you're not careful. Okay? Please, please, please be aware that we're not going political. So, and you kind of did that last time too. So I will boot you from the class if you're not careful. Imperialist DBQ, I only have 3 of them submitted. So once those all get submitted, then I will go ahead and I'll grade them all. Okay. My assumption is I will have all the DBQs graded probably by Wednesday. So hopefully you guys have feedback by the time you go to take your practice DBQ. Okay. All right, great. So this is actually a really good introduction into today's class. In terms of the chat and just overall. So today's class, and part of the reason we don't have an access code as well, today's class is not funny. It is not joking. It is not anything like that. We're going to be talking about really serious stuff that affects a lot of people. I just want to, again, give you quite a bit of a forewarning. I don't want to boot people, but I will boot people. I think some comments were made last class that I do know people were not happy about. And I really don't want to have to kick people out of class, but we just have to be super careful. And especially the closer that we get to 9/11, you guys are not aware. So remember when we did that 9/11 assignment a long time ago where we asked people about their experiences on 9/11? I just want to point out again, which is something I said all the way back then, we have more than normal amounts of students who directly knew somebody or is related to somebody who passed away on 9/11. Okay. So as we go through a lot of this stuff today, you have to realize that, again, this is massively impacting us. I believe I saw in that assignment, we have 15 people that are currently have parents that have been or will be deployed to the Middle East. So just make sure that you're aware of that. And and I'm sorry, this is like super negative. If any of you guys do go too far, I will make it go further. So I just want to point that out. In particular, if a single person says Bush did 9/11, you're automatically going to get booted, and I'm automatically going to be calling probably Mr. Bingham. Okay, everybody good? We just have to be very, very careful with what we say because we don't want to offend anybody today. Good? Nobody's responding, and I can't see anybody, but I'm just going to assume. Okay, great. Hopefully I didn't lose any people. All right, great. So on that note, so we're going to start off in today, and we're actually going to go a little bit back. I had 4 people specifically say that they wanted to go back and talk about things going on in the Middle East in the 1970s, which is actually what I would, why would you boot somebody if somebody says that? Because I'm not going to support conspiracy theories. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Like I said before, we have five people in particular who lost a direct family member on 9/11 that is directly related to them, not just somebody they knew or their parents knew. And I'm not going to support conspiracy theories, especially ones that are unproven. And if you say that they are proven, that's great. You can debate with me another time, but they are not proven. They are assumptions. And 2 is also the idea that I think that it trivializes and blames people who really the people responsible for that, which is what we're going to talk about today, are the terrorist groups who committed that act as well as the individual terrorists. So that's why I won't support Bush in 9/11 because I'm not going to support conspiracy theories in this class. So hopefully that clarifies that just a little bit, especially one that I find to be completely unfounded. And for the record, as I'll just point this out again, for all the students who say Bush did 9/11, and we actually had an incident where a substitute teacher this year, we had done our 9/11 thing that we did, and it wasn't an APUSH student, it was a core US student. That student came to me the next day and told me that and I don't know if you guys were in this class or not. I think it was an English class. The substitute teacher told the class that Bush did 9/11 and then presented several pieces of evidence showing that 9/11 was directly caused by the American government. And basically that student directly came into my class then. And in the middle of class, just like stood up and was like, Miss Ray, you're wrong that these people did 9/11. Bush did 9/11. And then he decided to pull up, I'm shocked that they're not blocked on the school computers, but several websites that the substitute teacher had shown them, showing that it was an inside job. Now, luckily for me, I have seen all that stuff. The notes that are on Canvas is just really quickly. So the notes that are on Canvas is a summary of the precursor to this, but I did not make a set of notes to this. But you should easily be able to answer the questions on the test. So I will have basically lecture style questions like the ones that you've already had previously, where it's like lecture questions 1, 2, 3, and 4. You should be able to easily answer those without any help from notes. I've already made them and they're relatively easy. But anyways, what I would say is that if you do disagree with me and think that it's an inside job, go ahead and sign up for a meeting with me, and I'd be very, very happy to refute your claims. Because every single claim that this student brought up, that the substitute brought up, I immediately counteracted it with a new claim that showed what their claim was that is incorrect. Anyway, so I'm going to get off my soapbox now and get back to the lecture. Again, 9/11 is an extremely touchy subject for me. I lived through 9/11, and I get that many of you were born in 2001, but I experienced 9/11. And I'm not going to go into this. I went into counseling because of 9/11 and my experiences. I'm not going to go into that. But I had some personal experiences associated with 9/11. I directly knew many people that moved to Idaho to get away from New York because of 9/11. And I know people who have died from 9/11. So it's a very, very touchy subject for me. So I apologize if I get super defensive about it. But again, know your audience. You never, 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 never know. Did you say the Middle East is all 9/11? I don't know what that means, but I will explain it in just a moment. I don't know what you mean by that, but we will explain all of it in just a second, okay? Anyway, so we're going to go into the Middle East, but we're going to start in the 1970s, okay? And it kind of leads to the precursor of understanding what happens in the 1980s that contributes this. By the way, we had 29 people submit ideas for lectures over the next couple of days. 23 of those 29 directly said 9/11 in the Middle East. So that's kind of why I decided to do this entire thing like by myself, okay? So starting in the Middle East, and we're going to go back a little bit and talk about going into Israel, okay? So, and I apologize, I meant to talk about this today, but apparently I didn't say that very well enough, so I apologize, but we are going to go back just a little bit because it's a perfect precursor into issues going on in the Middle East, okay? So if you guys don't know why Israel was created, and in particular issues with Palestinian and Israeli conflict, following World War II, the UN, along with several other nations, decide that they are going to create a Jewish state called Palestine in Israel. And if you don't know what's going on with Israel, Israel is traditionally seen as a very much a holy state. BYU actually used to have an offshoot. So there was like BYU Idaho, BYU Hawaii, and then there was BYU Israel, which actually has just barely started to go away over the last 10 years or so. But Israel was a really controversial thing. Should you recognize Israel or not? I like to compare it sort of to Taiwan. Taiwan, when it became independent from China, was very, very controversial. And a lot of people said, you should not accept it as Taiwan. And we're actually one of a handful of states that actually call Taiwan, Taiwan. Most call it the rebellious state of China. So regardless, though, Harry S. Truman is going to accept Israel and officially declare that Israel is a legitimate country due to this bringing into the Jewish state. Now, this was not something that was accepted by people in America. In fact, a lot of people said that it was unacceptable to be able to support this. He also accepted this without congressional approval. He did this on his own to say that Israel is a recognized state. Now, the issue in terms of overall conflict in the Middle East, so Palestine itself is the original state, and then Israel is going to be the Jewish land. And if you know anything about Palestinian Israeli conflict, the reason why is because Palestine, which again is the original Israel, all this little white stuff is going to be the Jewish land that was given to them by the UN. However, over time, we are now at this point where Israeli land has taken over the vast majority of Israel, as well as giving it very little land for the Palestinians. And in particular, the two biggest and probably most influential centers in Israel, which is Jerusalem and Bethlehem, are both very controversial of going on with whether or not there should be Palestinian or Israeli land. Jerusalem is officially in the Israeli land, but Bethlehem is technically in Palestinian land. So it's become extremely controversial. So then there starts to be controversy just in general over trade and economics, as we talked about before. The Suez Canal, which is going to go into Egypt, and it really becomes the major trade port rather than having to go all the way down around the Cape in Africa, becomes our major trading center. Well, then it becomes again controversial. Who should have this land? Originally, Egypt is going to nationalize it and say that they can get all of the money from it. Then people come back and say, wait, we shouldn't have it. The Somali pirate issue becomes an issue in general, but mostly it actually begins to rise in the 2000s, is when the highest rate of the Somali pirates, although they had been in there since the 1970s and 80s-ish. Then you're going to have a really interesting conflict, and this becomes the first major conflict going on with Israel, Palestine, and things like that. So what happens is you have the Yom Kippur War. And if you don't know what Yom Kippur is at this time in September-ish or end of September, you have two really big, and I'm sorry if you can't see the dates down here, you have really two big major holidays in the Jewish religion. You have Rosh Hashanah, which is going to be the Jewish New Year, which happens mid to late September every year. At the same time, you also have Yom Kippur, which is a 24-hour period. It's always at the end of the Jewish New Year. And it's a time when they celebrate atonement, repentance. A lot of people go through multiple different, especially very traditional Jewish families will, for example, not bathe, not use deodorant during that time. It's 25 hours of fasting, for example, unless you have special needs. And all of that comes around. It's really the holiest day in Jewish history. And what day are they going to start this war? On the holiest day in Jewish history. Wasn't there a near World War III thing? Yes. I'm just not going to go into it very much simply because of time, because we're going to go far into Middle Eastern conflict in just a moment. Interesting fact, though, by the way, and I'm going to go ahead and put this on my little soapbox. I just want to point out that the holiest day in the Jewish religion, which again has 25 hours of fasting, and oftentimes a lot of people in Jewish families will go to synagogues for that time, or also throughout Jewish New Year. Most states actually have it as a school holiday. So you'll have either the weekend off of Yom Kippur, or you'll also have, for example, the whole Jewish New Year, similar to how we have 2 weeks at Christmas. We do not have that in Utah, although if you do end up living somewhere else, such as California and New York, most of those states have actually a week-long vacation at the end of September in order to help the Jewish community be able to celebrate that. So I just find it really interesting. It's also the same reason why a lot of people say we should move the AP exams, because the AP exams are over Ramadan for the Muslim religion. So anyways, and yeah, Sarah, you are correct. Most of my Jewish students do miss school. And actually a lot of states have a rule that says over Rosh Hashanah, you actually cannot assign any homework or tests during that time. But again, we do not have those protections here in Utah. But anyways, just a little fact about things. We then have the OPEC crisis, which we had talked about previously, where we have that massive gas shortage. The Camp David Accords attempted to bring peace to Palestine, Israel, as well as Egypt was brought in too, to be able to have the peace there. It falls apart a couple months later, so this is kind of getting into us being into this war. Iranian hostage crisis is going to go along the same exact time frame, and then it ends with the Suez Canal crisis is going to be the early 1970s. I think it's like 1971, 72-ish. And it ends with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Now, this is what I like to call the start of the War on Terror. This really begins the HC that leads eventually to 9/11, and this is going to be in 1979, but really 1980 is the major Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So this begins what, again, like I like to call the roots of terrorism. because this is going to kind of go into why 9/11 happened and then what happened afterwards because of it. So in 1979, right at the very end, the Soviet Union takes over Afghanistan, and what's called the Soviet-Afghan War begins. So very much Cold War, bring in communism into Afghanistan, which borders the USSR. At this time, they are going to institute a guy named Amin. Now, what happens is that he becomes very unpopular very, very quickly. Part of the reason why is first, he had a very harsh communist regime that really ended up having a lot of Stalin type of things happening in Afghanistan. He also said you would only have a single party rule. And then he also completely abolishes the Afghan constitution. So basically, the very first leader that the USSR institutes is hated by the vast majority of people in Afghanistan. Now, this is also going, oh, and sorry, this actually got really weird and I apologize. This also begins, and this was one person that put it in, specifically referenced this, so just let you know, is the start of what we call the holy struggle. Now, what happens is you're going to have a rebel group that gets instituted in Afghanistan in order to be able to fight against the USSR, communism, as well as the communist regime in Afghanistan. And this rebel force is created by Muslims who are wanting to keep this thing called jihad. Now, I want to explain really quickly about jihad and what it means. So in the Islamic religion, you have the Quran, the holy book. And in the Quran, it talks about a jihad, or an internal struggle, basically. Now, extremist jihadists will take that internal struggle and say that if other people are conflicting with your internal struggle, then you have the right to be able to do what is necessary to get rid of that struggle, aka 9/11, terrorism, and things like that. However, most people who see that word jihad in the Muslim religion basically see that as an internal struggle. So similarly to, for example, Christianity, am I being righteous? Am I being more Christ-like? This internal struggle. Should I drink alcohol? Should I not? That's what most Muslims take that jihadist idea, but it's an internal struggle that they internally do. However, when we get into extremist Islamic culture, that's where jihad becomes the violent one. So regardless, though, these are jihadists. They are the holy struggle, and they are going to attempt to train to be able to get rid of this oppressive regime. Now, this begins these jihadists who do eventually become, okay, hold on. I remembered it now. They do eventually transform into the Taliban, which eventually transforms into Al-Qaeda. So it goes from the beginning, then it goes into, oh my gosh, why do I keep forgetting the name? Taliban. And then eventually goes into Al-Qaeda. Although there is still the Taliban, but the Al-Qaeda has now referenced that they themselves are completely different. Yes, that's exactly who you're referring to. Where did they get these? So that's actually interesting. Thank you so much for going into my next couple of slides. Now, really quickly, before I get into what he was specifically referring to in the chat, which I don't think you guys can see, but that's totally fine. But anyways, what happens basically is that they are going to take traditional Muslim beliefs and they are going to make it originally into that jihadist idea of getting rid of the people who are combating their internal struggle, which begins with this idea of the USSR, communism, and different things like that. Well, what happens is we had this idea called the Reagan Doctrine. And what's going to happen with the Reagan Doctrine is Reagan says we need to do anything necessary to get rid of communism in the world. So what America starts to do is we do what's called Operation Cyclone, which is where we funded the Muslim freedom fighters to fight against the communist regime. So this starts in 1979, and we begin to send them. So this is where did they get those guns? It starts by being sent by the United States. Now, this is, again, when they are starting in the Mujahideen, which is the freedom fighters. This is where it starts. So in 1979, we give them $695,000. Okay, that's when the USSR invades. 1980s, we go up to 20 to 30 million. And by the end of the 1980s, in 1987, we sent them $630 million worth of aid to these freedom fighters. Yeah, I don't necessarily know so much about the rifles. I apologize, but I wish I did. But regardless, though, we begin to massively send them aid. So the one that the person had specifically talked about is how we aided them. We did aid them, but I just want to emphasize this was before they were the Taliban, before they were extremists. and I shouldn't say before they were extremists, they were pretty extreme, but before Al-Qaeda and ISIS and different things like that. There are a whole bunch of conspiracy websites that say America purposely funded the Taliban to be able to start 9/11. Again, Bush did 9/11, but there is no evidence of that. The aid actually stops in 1988, which is also the very first year that the Taliban begins to rise. So a lot of those militants did join the Taliban, which did eventually join Al-Qaeda, and then eventually goes into other groups such as ISIS and different things like that. So basically what happens is the Soviets are now concerned. There's massive amounts of political turbulence. You are correct. So what Miles is saying is correct. We did specifically fund them in order to be able to stop the Soviets. But we did not specifically fund them to stop 9/11. So very much a Cold War kind of mentality. So what happens basically is that they're now concerned that now what will possibly happen is if there's more turbulence, America might come in, allies might come in. So instead what they do is they are going to assassinate the president that they had originally instituted in Afghanistan. And instead, they are going to institute a new communist leader in Afghanistan. Well, what happens is now all of a sudden, the Soviets begin to massively push armory to be able to keep him as the ruler. So they're going to send 75,000 troops to install him as the ruler. This is also the exact same reason why we begin to increase our funding of the jihadists. So again, the holy strugglers, not going into the massive extremists, as we're going to see later, to be able to stop the Soviet invasion. Now, this is also the start of Osama bin Laden. So he starts by leaving his home country of Saudi Arabia, and he enters to help these freedom fighters that are happening in Afghanistan. And this is about in the mid-1980s. We're not 100% sure of that date. Now, the best skills that Osama bin Laden has is because his family was so rich, he actually received, interesting fact, an allowance every week of $22,000 to help supply the Taliban with money. So he actually basically self-funded the creation of the Taliban. Additionally, he was extremely well educated in the Middle East, which also allowed him to be able to make and create a whole bunch of money, as well as a good military force in the Taliban. So in 1988, so this is when the Taliban has begun to transform, and he begins to use his wealth and knowledge to be able to create a thing called Al-Qaeda. Now, I just want to point out that it really depends on the historian that you're going to talk to. The Taliban, so it goes from the Mujahideen, then it goes into the Taliban. Then the Taliban, about the same exact time, creates a new force called Al-Qaeda. Some historians will say the Taliban and Al-Qaeda are the same thing. According to the U.S. government, they are officially separate sections, but they do have the same belief systems. And a lot of them are interchangeable, where they'll go into both. I'll see sometimes they'll say the Taliban is doing this, Al-Qaeda is doing this. It depends on the historian that you talk to. For all intensive purposes, the most important thing to know is that the Taliban is there as the freedom fighters, but Osama bin Laden creates them specifically into the terrorist organization known as Al-Qaeda. I hope that made sense, and I hope I didn't screw that up. Okay, so basically what happens is they become this worldwide terrorist organization. But in the 1980s, we didn't think of that. In the 1980s, we actually thought Osama bin Laden was this fantastic freedom fighter getting rid of the communists in Afghanistan. So Al-Qaeda is devoted to a couple of things. First is the true understanding of Islam. The Quran becomes their book of truth that they are going to do a lot of their things because of. The destruction of non-Muslims, this becomes that internal struggle of jihadism that's going to especially rise in the 1990s, as well as the creation of a central Islamic dominance throughout the world. And this gets worse and worse as the 1990s progresses on and on. Now, bin Laden basically viewed all non-Muslims, especially countries such as Great Britain and the United States, as well as the Soviet Union, who basically were using Islamic resources for themselves, in particular oil, in particular using all these various resources in the Middle East against Muslims. And so the idea was that if you get rid of those people, you will help rise the greater Afghanistan and Muslims in the area. Well, in the late 1980s, Al-Qaeda begins to especially train people all over the world to be able to go against non-Muslim entities, in particular the United States and Christians throughout the world. Now, in 1989, the Soviets begin to withdraw from Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden returns to Saudi Arabia as a complete hero, and the United States refers to him and the soldiers as the freedom fighters, which is where you'll get that idea online. I just want to point out, so this is a newspaper article, and I just want to point out to you how great we saw Osama bin Laden. And again, I hear a lot of times people are like, well, that's because we kept it a secret, or, well, why didn't we know? Hindsight is always going to be 2020. Regardless, though, we saw him as this anti-Soviet guy who is going to save the world. In fact, several organizations named him Person of the Year in the 1990s, especially in the early 1990s, as they saw Osama bin Laden as this great guy destroying the Soviets and different things like that. So this begins to change, though, and especially now we're going to start to switch away from Osama bin Laden, and we're going to start to switch into Iraq. So Iraq is going to be right here, and right next to Iraq is this little place called Kuwait. And Kuwait is extremely small in comparison to Iraq. Well, there's this leader named Saddam Hussein, and Saddam Hussein is going to be the president, ruler, whatever you want to call him, in Iraq. He did refer to himself as a president multiple times, but it's not the president that we would see here in the United States. So he, in August of 1990, begins to accuse Kuwait of several different things. First, he accuses that all along the border of Iraq, there were multiple oil fields that Kuwait was stealing oil from Iraq. Then, additionally, what happens is that he also begins to say that Kuwait was actually originally part of Iraq, but what happened is that they have been sectioned off by imperialists in the early 1900s and mid-1900s, which led Kuwait to leave, even though they had no permission to leave. Interestingly enough, though, Kuwait was actually established before Iraq was ever established, so interesting fact. Really quick, I need to read this. So the question is, what made him change the view on the U.S., or what made him have anti-U.S. sentiment? In my opinion, it goes more and more and more radical as time goes on. So as he begins to gain more power, more wealth, more militant, he begins to have more radicalized ideas. And in particular, his perception of the Quran begins to change, of an internal struggle being portrayed as worse than an internal struggle and starting to fight against other people. Additionally, you have to remember, America was funding all this stuff that was happening. And we're going to talk about, again, the Gulf War in just a second. But in my opinion, I think a lot of it comes down to he starts to hate other countries having so much influence in Afghanistan. He starts to reinterpret the Quran. And as more militant as he gets more and more anti-world as time goes on. The Soviets invaded Afghanistan. Depends on who you ask. Afghanistan says that the reason they invaded it is due to conflicts on the border. However, if you ask the United States, a lot of people say, one, to spread communism, although that's probably not the biggest impact. I think, in my opinion, at this time, the Soviets are expanding all throughout their borders to get resources and assets that they need. They're creating basically little satellite nations. And Afghanistan does have a lot of richness, such as oils, such as minerals, diamonds, things like that, that the Soviet Union wanted. So in my opinion, it's that. But if you ask if you ask the USSR or Russia, their textbooks say it's because Afghanistan was pushing their beliefs onto, Afghanistan was basically militant against the USSR, is what they had said at the time. So regardless, though, this is what's going to happen over in Kuwait. Now, what ends up happening is basically Saddam Hussein begins to take it a step further. He lets Kuwait know that you have two options. The first option is you do nothing to solve the problem, and we will invade you. The second option is you forgive $30 billion of debt that Iraq had to Kuwait, or we will then invade you. So what happens is, through all of this, on August 2nd of 1990, Saddam Hussein ends up invading into Kuwait, officially beginning what's about to be called the Gulf War. Now, he annexes Kuwait. So I just want to point out there's that word that we've talked about before. He officially calls it the 19th province of Iraq, and he officially takes it over, and it falls very, very, very quickly to the Iraqi forces. Now, basically what happens is immediately the UN begins to assemble. Saddam Hussein made a drastic mistake in this situation. He thought that everybody was going to support him around him in the Middle East. But in fact, Saddam Hussein, 2/3 of all Middle Eastern countries, immediately issued a declaration saying what he did was wrong. In addition to almost all UN countries also said that what he did was wrong. And yes, Kuwait is extremely tiny in comparison to Iraq. But I like to think of it similar to how Germany invaded Czechoslovakia, because he invaded it because he thought that it was part of it. And one of Saddam Hussein's reasonings for invading Kuwait is he believed that Kuwait, the actual Kuwait itself should actually be part of Iraq and not its own countries. So regardless, though, is that the UN is going to all of a sudden send massive amounts of army and artillery shells right outside of Kuwait, threatening war with Saddam Hussein. They basically say, Saddam, you have a choice. You either pull out or we're going to go to war. He tries to pull America and the UN's bluff. And then what ends up happening, please don't draw on my screen. What ends up happening is it ends up resulting in the creation of the Gulf War. So what happens with the Gulf War is basically, it's also called Operation Desert Storm. It's only about a 42-day conflict. And we start by massively sending in, especially the Air Force. And in my opinion, this is what solidifies the Air Force. The Air Force had been used previously, but I think when we think in our heads of what the Air Force does, like Top Gun and things like that, the Gulf War is really what solidifies what's going on there. So basically what happens is they start with the U.S. Air Force. And the U.S. Air Force had several new technologies that they were able to use that really made it a massive benefit for them. So first, they had the very first use of stealth bombers in American history. We also had what are called Tomahawk, which are also called cruise and guided missiles, which basically can be launched from a ship and end up exploding something hundreds of miles away. We had smart bombs, which are dropped from a normal Air Force plane, and basically the smart bombs can actually relocate and then avoid targets like this, and then eventually hit whatever target it has. And we also had the very first night vision smart missiles, which basically said even though it's dark, it can still hit its target using like GPS and different things like that. So the Gulf War becomes a very short war, and it's partially because, again, Kuwait's very small and Iraq was very much overwhelmed. They begin to fall very, very quickly. After the original Air Force pilots fly in, then you start the next one, which is Operation Desert Saber, which is where we started ground forces. When we sent ground forces in, Iraq and Kuwait fall in only a matter of about 10 to 15 days, so very quickly overall. Well, following the Gulf War, which again, very, very short, Operation Desert Storm was only about 42 days long from start to finish. This is when Osama bin Laden becomes extremist. So because American troops were on Saudi soil, and because he saw that America had supposedly instituted a very corrupt government in Saudi Arabia and nearby countries, Osama begins to get extremely radicalist. And again, this is where the Taliban and Al-Qaeda begin to become much more terroristic and extremist. Saudi Arabia therefore banishes Osama bin Laden, and he officially lives in exile in Sudan, which is where the vast majority of the Al-Qaeda growth is going to happen in Sudan. Now, Saddam Hussein is a very controversial figure. What I can tell you is we've never really liked him. So while Saddam Hussein has been the leader again in Iraq, really following the Gulf War, we are not fans of Saddam Hussein. So don't think that we ever, like Osama bin Laden, liked him. We never really liked him, but he's going to be the leader in Iraq. Now, on February 26, 1993, this is the first major terrorist attack on American soil during this whole idea of the Middle East. So a lot of people aren't aware that the World Trade Center was bombed prior to 9/11. Which we've talked about previously. So what they attempted to do is basically in these twin towers, there were these garages underneath. They were about 8 stories tall. They planned to explode the garage. And what they thought that would do is it would create a giant hole and the entire building would collapse on top of it. That's what you're seeing right here. The problem is what they didn't expect is that instead of exploding outward, it exploded downward. So basically what happened is, and I don't know if it went off early. I'm not as smart about this event as I probably could possibly see. 8 stories deep. So what happens is that the explosion goes off on the first level of the parking garage, and then it goes directly down. So really all it destroyed was the hotel, not the actual twin towers itself. Although, this is an interesting fact, all the smoke that was from down here actually entered the elevator shaft and went up the twin towers. It did show that if there was an explosion that were to go off, it could possibly destroy the central system of the twin towers. However, nobody thought that this was going to happen again. Is there a reason why after that attack we didn't prepare the twin towers for bomb attacks or anything? Again, hindsight is always 20/20. So part of the thing that you have to realize is after this, we thought, we're great. This bomb goes off, this huge bomb that they thought was going to bring down everything, and yet it went directly down. So I think a lot of it was not thinking that this could happen again because it already failed. So for example, there was this guy, and I think it was back in like 2005, 2006. He was traveling to Chicago or from Chicago, something like that, on Christmas Day. And he gets known as what's called the Christmas Day Bomber. And the reason he was called the Christmas Day Bomber is because what he did is, as soon as I think it was right after they had taken off from Chicago, he had all the little bottles. So you know how when you fly, you have all these cute little bottles? Well, what happened is each of those cute little bottles had bomb materials in it. So it was basically, instead of having a giant thing of bomb materials, he separated them into the little packs that you're allowed to have. And then when he got on the plane, people saw like him, and don't think of this the wrong way. He had put his hands into his pants and he was like messing around down there. And the reason why is because this is why he's called the underwear bomber, is because he was mixing all the ingredients to make the bomb. And then they noticed that he had smoke coming from his underpants. And that's when people tackled him, got the objects away, and prevented the explosion from happening. Somebody asked, why were the Twin Towers specifically targeted? In both case scenarios, they are the true symbol of capitalism. At the time, the Twin Towers were the tallest building in the entire world. If you watch any movie pre-9/11, this tower is in every single TV show, movie that happens in New York. In fact, the average New York City TV show that has their main center of their TV show in New York shows the Twin Towers an average of 1.2 times per episode. And the reason why is because they were so iconic. It'd kind of be like having a TV show in Washington, D.C. and never showing the Capitol building or the White House. It was just so iconic. The problem is everybody who had offices on these Twin Towers were very capitalistic places. A lot of them were banking. A lot of them were loan industries, different things like that. A guy did do a rope walk across. You are correct on that. And he ended up getting arrested for that, but he did do it. So these were really the symbolism of capitalism and greed in the world. Because, for example, why did they have to build this so big? Why didn't they just make multiple buildings? That would make more sense, right? But instead, America says, no, we're going to build the tallest, greatest, most wonderful building in the entire world. And that's what the idea was from the Islamic jihadists, is this was the center of greed and capitalism in the world. And I do just want to point out that when these attacks happened, they were not directly linked to Osama bin Laden. They were not directly linked to Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. As time goes on, and especially post 9/11, that's when people begin to make the connections and different things like that of what had happened in there. So yeah, the idea was that build up instead of build wider. You are correct on that one. So regardless, though, what basically happens from there is that after this attack, that really begins our fear of terrorism going on throughout the world. Oh, by the way, if you ever go to the 9/11 monument, look for this section of the Twin Tower monument. These are the people who died on that original terrorist attack, and they did put them on the original thing. So if you ever end up seeing that, I personally think that that was really sweet that they did that, to be able to add these people from the 1993 attack that had happened as well. So 1994 and 1993 is really the year that things begin to turn. So in 1994, under Osama bin Laden's leadership, Al-Qaeda begins to organize global terrorist attacks around the world. This is when the official word extremist jihadism officially begins, and it's originally said by Osama bin Laden. And the idea of that is that it is the Muslim duty to maintain their religion, even if it costs other people's lives. This is when the Saudi Arabian government then begins to push harder on Osama bin Laden. They force him to relinquish his citizenship and his passport, and his family disowns him, cutting off a $7 million stipend that they had been funding, really, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and different things like that. So in 1994 is when the major terrorist attacks begin to move. And all throughout the 1990s, you'll see all these massive terrorist attacks happening, not boom, 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 but about once a year in the 1990s. So, for example, you're going to have, if you've ever seen the movie Black Hawk Down, that's where we're going to start with this one. So basically what happens is the U.S. soldiers in Somalia begin to get bombed by extremist jihadists. Because of that, a helicopter that was going through ends up getting shot down. And again, if you see the movie, which I think is rated R, so ask your parents' permission, this gets shot down, and then the American soldiers begin to fight off all the militants attempting to kill them. I think if I remember correctly, in the end, only one or two of them end up surviving that crash and becomes the famous Black Hawk Down. At the same exact time, truck bombs all throughout the Middle East begin to go off. So, for example, this is one right outside the U.S. Embassy where over 500 people end up being killed by this bomb going off. all throughout the Middle East, you have these massive terrorist attacks where the whole idea of terror is you never know when it's going to happen. And for somebody saying that this was a really big crater, that's because the TNT was so large that the crater actually ended up going down about 25 feet deep because there was so much bomb items in that crater and different things like that. It's about 25 feet is about how much it was. Additionally, you start to be able to kill innocent civilians. So for example, in Egypt at the Luxor, so the Luxor was is basically this area of Egypt where there's all these like ancient Egyptian relics and things like that. One of those is a temple, and at the time you could actually walk up this and you could go into the temple. You can no longer do that anymore, but you used to be able to go inside of the temple and go and see it. Well, when everybody had gone inside, two terrorists ended up basically blocking off the entrance, began massively shooting everybody inside, and kill 81 tourists from around the world inside of this temple, which is then when it was closed off to the public, which you can't see it anymore. Additionally, several U.S. embassies in 4 different countries begin to get bombed. So you can see, again, an increase in terrorism and different things like that, and death throughout the Middle East due to terrorism. In 1996, Sudan ends up exiling Osama bin Laden, and that's when he takes refuge in Afghanistan. And just to let you know, that is, again, when we start to bring into Afghanistan. And again, this is also when the Taliban, so again, the Taliban is really Afghanistan's militia that we talked about previously when we talked about the movement from the Mujahideen. And sorry, I totally messed that up. I'm just thinking in my head of like 90 things. But basically what happens is he begins to kind of combine Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. So he moved a lot because he continues to constantly be kicked out of his various countries for the actions that he ends up doing. So he ends up taking refuge in Afghanistan. And while in Afghanistan, he begins to massively train his units in Al-Qaeda. In particular, about 20,000 Al-Qaeda militants by the late 1990s. He also then begins to select certain people to begin to do terrorist, or to begin to be trained for terrorist attacks and terrorist cells around the world. Now, in 1996, Osama bin Laden officially issues a series of what are called a fatwa. And a fatwa is an official religious statement, and basically they declare a holy war. ISIS also does this, and we'll talk about ISIS next class. But ISIS does this today as well. And in these fatwas, they officially declare a holy war against the United States. Why did they not like it? Is, again, they believed that they were pillaging natural resources in the Muslim world, in particular oil, as well as several gems and things like that that are used as well, and also assisting in all the enemies of Islam. So this is when they officially declared the United States is bad. So you can see this is a statement by Osama bin Laden. It says the ruling to kill the Americans and their allies, civilians, and military is an individual duty for every Muslim who can do it in any country in which it is possible to do it. Every Muslim who believes in God and wishes to be rewarded to comply with God's order to kill the Americans and plunder their money wherever and whenever they find it. So basically what happens is at this same exact time, America ends up basically indicting Osama bin Laden for war crimes throughout the world. We've done the same thing with Kim Jong-un has also been indicted by the United States. And the Clinton administration begins to launch massive missile attacks in Sudan and Afghanistan. And the idea was this was going to end the Osama bin Laden issue. But here's the interesting part. At the same time that this happens, something else happens with Clinton. Now, when we talk about this, we're all going to be mature adults. Got it? Okay, mature adults. So, here's what happens. Okay? Bill Clinton is the president. His wife, Hillary Clinton. They're Democrats. Around this same time, he starts to have this aide named Monica Lewinsky. And people kind of started in the White House to assume something might be happening because he really spent a lot of time with Monica Lewinsky. So she gets reassigned on purpose to the Pentagon in an attempt to get her away from Bill Clinton. Well, while she is in the Pentagon, there is a lawsuit filed against Bill Clinton. And originally, Bill Clinton had sued, saying that you could not sue or make charges against the president until after he left the presidency. And it becomes this really famous case called Clinton v. Jones, and it was about this lady who accused Bill Clinton of sexual harassment. Well, in that trial, both Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky had made official statements that were in the record that said they had never had any sort of relationship. I'm not going to get into the details of why Bill Clinton said that he did not. Bill Clinton continues to maintain his innocence today. And the reason why, and I'm not going to go into this, you can ask your parents' permission, and you can go ask them if you want. He basically said they hung out, but what they didn't constitute as hanging out, if you know what I mean. Okay? So basically what happens is he says, I never lied because my understanding of what sexual intercourse was in the affidavit aligned and said I didn't do it. And I'm not going to go into the in-depth analysis of that, but regardless, though, he still maintains his innocence today. Well, they submit this and everything is calm. Well, Monica Lewinsky, when she's at the Pentagon, makes friends with this lady named Linda Tripp. And Linda Tripp begins to hear that she says that she has slept with Bill Clinton. And so she goes to a special prosecutor and basically says that in exchange for secretly recording her conversations with Monica Lewinsky, she would not receive any sort of punishment for illegal wiretapping of their conversations. So she begins to record all these conversations with Monica Lewinsky that basically prove that Bill Clinton lied under oath and did have sexual relations with Monica Lewinsky. Now, what happens is basically the investigator then begins to press charges, begins to look into impeachment over this whole thing. He famously maintains where he does say, I did not have sexual relations with that woman, specifically referring to Monica Lewinsky. However, they then post the tapes. Bill Clinton says there's no evidence, that's hearsay. And then here's where we all had to be extremely mature. You see, Monica Lewinsky in her conversations with Linda Tripp revealed that she had something. And that something was a dress, the famous Monica Lewinsky dress. Now, I'm not going to tell you what was on that dress. But what I can tell you is it was a dress she wore with Bill Clinton when they were hanging out. There was some stuff on the dress, and that stuff had DNA evidence that proved that she had slept with Bill Clinton. Go ask your parents what that is if you really don't get what I'm trying to say here. But to keep it PG, what I can tell you is there was DNA evidence that proved it. And basically, Linda Tripp had told her, don't get the dress cleaned, keep it. She kept it for 3 years after her initial relationships with Bill Clinton, and then it was entered in as evidence. The FBI did do DNA analysis and did confirm that it was a bodily thing of Bill Clinton. Now, basically what happens is that this completely proves that Bill Clinton definitely had relationships, and the whole impeachment thing is because he lied under oath. So they bring up articles of impeachment against him. He gets impeached in the House of Representatives, but does not get convicted in the Senate. So very similar to Donald Trump, where he is found guilty in the House, but he is not found guilty in the Senate. Interesting thing, though, in comparison to Trump versus Clinton, and a lot of people don't know this. So when Trump was impeached, all the Democrats voted against him. When Clinton was impeached, all the Democrats, which he was a Democrat, 100% of the Democrats voted for impeachment of Bill Clinton. So I think it's really interesting how we've actually switched because all of his political party went against him in his impeachment, whereas it's very different compared to now when you think of Donald Trump. Anyways, interesting fact, though, she did die about 3 days ago. So if you've seen in the news a whole bunch of stuff about Bill Clinton, it's because Linda Tripp died just a few days ago. But here's why you might want to care about this. So this idea of the Monica Lewinsky scandal and things like that has lasted with Bill Clinton. Interesting fact. So this is his official portrait. So when you leave the presidency, somebody is commissioned to do an official portrait of you, and it goes up into the National Portrait Gallery, which is at the Smithsonian. Well, the artist decided to play a little hint to Bill Clinton. He hung up while he was painting a dress and then painted that shadow, which is right here, onto the official painting, specifically referencing the Monica Lewinsky dress. Bill Clinton was not happy about it. He asked for the Smithsonian to remove it. They said, no, it's the official portrait, and it still hangs in the Smithsonian with the reference to the Monica Lewinsky dress. Bill Clinton did commission a new portrait. So this is, by the way, what it looks like. So every time you see it, go look at Monica Lewinsky's dress with the stuff on it. And then he did ask somebody else to do a new portrait of him, and then he paid to have it on loan at the Smithsonian. So you can go see this way larger portrait instead of looking at the one that he doesn't want you to go look at in the Smithsonian. So why does any of this matter? Well, Bill Clinton authorizes assault against Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden of what they were doing. But everybody said the only reason he did it is because of this scandal and to get people not talking about the scandal. So the timing was horrible. So what happens is he bombs America. The American public says we shouldn't be bombing Osama bin Laden. He pulls back, and that allows Osama bin Laden to rise without fear of the Americans bombing him. So we then begin several missile launches against Osama bin Laden, much less than we probably would have been earlier. We begin to bomb basically what we think are Osama bin Laden's targets, but instead they ended up being pharmaceutical companies as well as hospitals. So we misguided our missiles and bombed the wrong areas due to really bad information that had come in to the United States. And then at the same exact time, basically a think tank. How did we do that? We had horrible intelligence, and we took any intelligence that was possible. Kind of like the USS Maine, where we said, oh my gosh, it's Spain, and then we found out later it wasn't. Our intelligence at the time had a little bit of a straw that said, yes, this was Osama bin Laden's areas, but instead we went off of that rather than true sound intelligence. So we also created a new organization, or not we, but several people created new organizations saying that we need to be concerned about Iraq and things that are going on in there. This is led by a guy named Dick Cheney, who is the vice president of George W. Bush. He's going to become very, very controversial as time goes on. He also is the CEO at the same time of a major oil industry that, fun fact, makes millions and billions of dollars from the Middle East oil. So he starts to say, so this is actually a statement he made in 1997, the good Lord didn't see fit to put oil and gas only where there are democratically elected regimes friendly to the United States. He begins to mention that he wants to have more and more oil and get it out of there. In 2000, we have our first really big terrorist attack. And basically what happens is in a plot called the Millennial Plot, the idea was that there was going to be 4 terrorist attacks on American soil. So one was going to be at LAX, that gets foiled. One was going to be, I believe, in Washington, D.C., that gets foiled. Then there were going to be 2 in the Middle East, but they both massively fail. Probably the most of the Jordan sites, that's what I was referring to. And the USS Sullivan's is probably the biggest fail. They ended up taking a boat with explosives. They put it into the side. It did explode, but it did not sink the ship. However, what also happens is later on, another suicide bomber hits another ship, the USS Cole, and it kills 17 servicemen. So this is your intro into 9/11 the month before, or a couple months before, excuse me. Skipping a couple things for time. At the same exact time, Dick Cheney ends up creating what's called the Energy Task Force, specifically to address the oil issues going on in America. In March 5th of 2001, they come up with a list of all of our possible oil, and this is the list for everybody but Iraq and Iran. And then you go into Iran, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and we have multiple sites that we said would be perfect for us to acquire for our own oil, which is, again, when we start to talk about the Iraqi and Afghani war, you're going to want to remember this stuff because it's part of the reason people say we went into those wars for alternative purposes such as oil. So basically what happens, and this is going to happen a few months before, so on April 10th of, not April 10th, 2004, August 6th of 2001, President Bush gets an official statement that says that they believe Osama bin Laden is going to strike the United States in some way. Now, it said we don't necessarily know when they're going to strike, but we believe that they are going to strike. Now, the day before 9/11, we receive and intercept a message that says the match is about to begin and tomorrow is 0 hour. This message was not interpreted until September 12th of 2001. Now, you might say, well, shouldn't we have known? Shouldn't we have been able to stop this? At the time, the data center where they ended up getting this received 2 million messages every hour. And the CIA has said that even if they had received this, there's no way they could have stopped 9/11 because they wouldn't have known how the terrorist attack was going to be. Now, we've all talked about 9/11 in the past, so I'm not going to necessarily focus on the events of 9/11. We had a whole day when we talked about that previous. But a lot of people said, what was the immediate impact of 9/11? Now, we've talked a lot about the emotional impact that we've referenced before. I want to show you a quick clip And it kind of summarizes everything that we've talked about before in terms of the changes. And you've probably seen this clip before. And if you have, I'm sorry. It's a really good clip for everybody to be able to see. So what this clip is so, whoa, not that. So in this clip, so this is about Lilo and Stitch, and Lilo and Stitch was supposed to come out only a few weeks after 9/11. Instead, it premiered a year later. And the whole reason why they had to redo it is because of the video clip I'm about to show you. So the left is the original, and the right is in reference to what the new version was. So you've probably seen this before, but it's a really good example of how we had to change things due to 9/11.
I don't know, maybe the company's called Four Piece.
Okay, so you get kind of the general gist of what they had to change. Oh, the lag is real. I'm sorry. But anyways, so I just want to point out with this, and you can just Google this too. So if you couldn't see the video very well, I apologize. But you can see that they obviously had to change this due to the fear of airplanes and different things like that, which we've talked about extensively in the past of how different it is now compared to what it was back then. But in particular, also, you have to think of what happens domestically due to 9/11. And one of those impacts is going to be especially on Muslims in America. So you can see right here, we went from hate crimes, very small, to massive amount of hate crimes against Muslims in the United States. Now, part of this issue was, again, massive fear of Muslims coming into America and destroying things. Every year around the anniversary of 9/11, you will also see a huge rise. Why did it drastically go down? A lot of it is the immediate fear and impact. So immediate fear and scare, and then it begins to massively lessen as time goes on, even though we do have obviously still a massive increase compared to before. I think that we talked about this. Did we talk about the mosque that people tried to make in New York City? I think we talked about that, but why did it increase in 2010? It's because we started to push, think about 2010 is also right around the anniversary of the 10th anniversary of 9/11. And we did see a massive increase going into the 10th anniversary. Every year on the anniversary, there's some sort of an event that happens as well. I talked about this before, but but for example, they wanted to build a mosque near 9/11. This guy ended up saying that if you build a mosque near 9/11, that is racist against true Americans. Saying that Muslims are not true Americans. And always around this time, you end up having some sort of an incident. And there's still a lot of incidents today. Even if you, for example, have Arabic heritage or Middle Eastern heritage, you might feel these impacts as well. I'll give you a really personal example. And I was thinking that I haven't asked him yet. So my babysitter, she is an Iraqi refugee who came over here in the 1990s when the Osama bin Laden and things like that was all rising in the Middle East. Her husband works for the United States government. He used to be a war correspondent, and he specifically is in the terrorism and Middle Eastern relations. I was considering asking if he wanted to be a guest speaker so you guys could ask him about his experiences in the Middle East. But regardless, though, they are all an Iraqi family. They all have Iraqi heritage. They all speak Arabic, and they all have a really thick accent. So a couple weeks ago, she got sick. This was right the week when coronavirus in Utah was just barely beginning to rise. There were no known cases in terms of community spread. So she ends up getting sick, so she ends up going to the doctor. And when she's at the doctor, they ended up specifically referencing to the hospital. And all she had was a fever, and she had a bad headache or whatever. And so when she went there, they were like, oh, you must be from the Middle East. And she's like, no, I'm American. I'm a naturalized citizen. And they're like, no. You just traveled here from the Middle East. So we know it. You're one of those people. They kept referencing her as those people coming over. And she's like, no, I've lived in the United States and in Utah since 1993. I'm an American. Here's my driver's license. I'm an American citizen. And they kept asking her, have you traveled to the Middle East? Have you traveled to the Middle East? And she says, no, I've never traveled to the Middle East in about 2 years. And they were like, oh, we're pretty sure you're lying to us. So they tested her for coronavirus back when there was only 15 people being tested in Utah. And in the statement that she showed me, they said specifically it's because they believed that she was lying because they believe she had to have been traveling back to the Middle East due to her thick accent. So it's kind of interesting to see even somebody as simple as that is still getting an impact. And I will say when I heard that, I was really ticked off. I don't think she was as ticked off because she's used to it. But I was not happy, and I wrote a letter. I never got a response back, but I did write a very angry letter to the urgent care that she was sent to. But regardless, though, you can see a lot of those impacts and things like that in terms of today. So what happens immediately following 9/11? On September 18th of 2001, they issue an official declaration that states that they can use any force and all means necessary to stop terrorism in the world. So domestically, what happens? Well, what happens is they also pass what's known as the Patriot Act. And both of those give the United States government a lot of leeway to be able to stop terrorism in the world. So first starts with NSA, which is NSA surveillance. Can somebody mention in the comments if I have talked to you guys about my student who got caught by the FBI on a school Chromebook? Can anybody? Yeah, okay, good. I talked to you guys about that. So that was an example, for instance, of the surveillance by the NSA. I will quickly review it since only Gabe apparently knows what's going on. So basically what happened is that I had a student, he looked up how to build a bomb on his school Chromebook. He went missing the next day. The FBI had showed up and they took him away. We didn't see him for about 3 weeks. When he came back, he was a whole new person. But part of the reason they were able to catch him is due to this NSA of surveillance. Now, the idea of NSA surveillance is controversial, but you'll notice again, what do we think of this? So you can see that as time has gone on, we have still maintained pretty steady lines of whether we approve of it or not. Again, 54% of Americans approve of NSA surveillance and 42% or disapprove, and 42% of Americans approve of it. So it's still really about half and half of whether or not NSA and things like that. We do have a massive NSA data center here in Utah. Another thing they start is what's called warrantless surveillance. So they begin to wiretap people without their knowledge and without a warrant. That was completely justified until about 2007 when we began to stop that program. Additionally, this is when Guantanamo Bay comes up, where we're able to put people into Guantanamo Bay. They have to be foreigners, so they cannot be American citizens. And we can put them into Guantanamo Bay. They are not allowed to have a lawyer. They are not given due process. So they can be there for 9-10 months without being charged. Some people can be there for 10 to 15 years without ever having any sort of legal trial. This is also when we start to have a huge increase in torture, in particular waterboarding. Waterboarding is where you make somebody feel like they're drowning even though they don't. This was not revealed to public information that it was a torture technique that we were using it. And for the statement of, in my opinion, Guantanamo Bay is a crime against humanity. According to the 8th Amendment, you cannot have cruel and unusual punishment, but that only applies to on American soil and American citizens. So America's official point of view is that because Guantanamo Bay is in Cuba, it is not on American soil, and because they are not American citizens, they do not deserve the right to the 8th Amendment. That is the idea of Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay is supposed to be shut down, but it's been a really, really long time. And again, unconstitutional does not apply to non-American citizens off foreign ground. That is the justification that the U.S. government has said. And I do agree with you, is going into whether or not it should be justified or not. That's on you guys. I do know, I think that the current rate is something like 55% of Americans support the use of torture tactics. I do think it's still the majority, but I'm not 100% sure of whether or not we accept it. So anyways, this begins, and I'm sorry this is taking slightly longer. This should be about probably 10, 15 minutes. This is a huge amount of history to put in a very short PowerPoint presentation. So anyway, so what happens, and you guys can totally continue to debate as long as you don't hate each other in the chat. I do think it's a very interesting thing of whether or not we should have torture or not. But regardless. So America then begins an invasion of Iraq, or Afghanistan, excuse me. So the invasion of Afghanistan, so the Afghani-American War, or however you want to call it, there's a lot of different names for it. Whatever the cause is, us going into Afghanistan is specifically in reference to 9/11. So I just want to emphasize that as we go into Iraq, the Iraqi War later. So on October 7th of 2001, we officially begin a massive bombing campaign on Afghanistan. And this is going to be a lot of stuff in a very short amount of time. So remember, September 11th, October 7th, we massively began to bomb throughout Afghanistan. Now, on November 9th, Taliban forces begin to fall. Very quickly, in a 7-day span, multiple major Taliban bases fall to the United States. So again, very, very quick in terms of what's going on in Afghanistan. On November 14th, the UN officially says that America has done their duty and has gotten rid of the majority of the Taliban forces. They officially declare in Resolution 1378 that they are going to send peacekeeping organizations to restore the government in Afghanistan. In December of 2001, that is when Osama bin Laden officially goes into hiding. So he is gone. The day after he is gone, I forgot this was in here. By the way, he does eventually get captured on May 1st, 2011. That for me is one of those places I'll always know where I was when I heard Osama bin Laden had been killed. For a lot of people, that was kind of like the end of 9/11, for most people of what they would say. And probably one of Obama's, is probably in the history books going to be one of Obama's greatest strengths, is eventually capturing Osama bin Laden. The day after Osama bin Laden goes into hiding, the Taliban is officially declared dead by the United States as well as the United Nations. The Taliban has officially fallen. And you might say, great, that's the end of the Afghanistan war. This is when the controversy occurs. The Taliban falls only about 4 months. Oh, Miles, you raised your hand. Did you have something to say? It says you raised your hand. Oh, okay. I've never had that happen. I wasn't prepared. So only 4 months after 9/11, the Taliban officially falls. Is that when we pull out of Afghanistan, though? No, we are still in Afghanistan. We even just barely passed a joint resolution 2 weeks ago about Afghanistan. So I think really the concern about Afghanistan, the vast majority of Americans support the entry into Afghanistan due to 9/11. But the question is, when should we have pulled out or when should we have stopped? That's really what the question is. Now, we continue to go on to this. So Operation Anaconda is the next step. And Operation Anaconda is about 5 months after the Taliban has fallen. But it's kind of weird because everyone's like, why are we doing more attacks when we're supposed to be gone? Well, the defense secretary basically officially says the word, we are now in a war on terror. And he specifically references concerns regarding Iraq. Now, on April 17th of 2002, so I just want to point out how long it's been, 18 years, we officially declared the reconstruction of Afghanistan begins. So in 2002, we officially declared that it's going to be rebuilt, but it continues to have issues today. The Taliban rises, Al-Qaeda rises, ISIS falls, Taliban falls. We have peace. We don't have peace. We instill government. We don't instill government. So even though, and yes, the Anaconda was a tactic in civil war. So again, a lot of people's concern regarding Afghanistan really has to do with when should we have pulled out and should we have pulled out already? I hope that that makes sense. So the Taliban falls. We succeeded our goals in Afghanistan, but we are still in Afghanistan even up until today. I was just reading that Trump did declare that he would not support the current Afghanistan government. And as of, I think it was 3 weeks ago, signed a declaration saying that they want peace and they want to make more peace with the Taliban. But that's something that's been going on for 18 years. So it's almost like the war that never ends, I guess, if that makes sense, hopefully, to you guys. Now, this is where we start to get controversial. So this is for all you conspiracy theories and things like that. So basically what happens is now we're going to get into the Iraqi war. And if you're going to choose which one to be disagreeing about, I would say that the Iraqi war is probably the most controversial. So this is the defense secretary, and he comes out in his book later and says, Bush told us, this is 2 days after 9/11, I want you as soon as you can to go back over everything. See if Saddam did this. Once he was told the evidence against Al-Qaeda was overwhelming, he said he wants any shred that Saddam Hussein was involved. So basically, a lot of the concern over Iraq is, had we been planning to invade Iraq for a long time, did we want to take them over, whatever cost would be? Now, basically what happens is over the next couple of years, constantly talking about, was Iraq responsible for 9/11? Was it responsible for before? But what really comes to its head is regarding what is called a weapon of mass destruction. Now, basically what happens is we had two major informants, and those informants let us know that throughout all of Afghanistan, they had weapons of mass destruction. Now, these weapons of mass destruction were not nuclear weapons, but they were really, really bad weapons. And this fear of, are we 45 minutes away from an attack? Are there secret military bases all over? Well, here's where it starts to get really interesting. Back in 2016, when Trump was running for election, he said in his speech, they lied. They said there were weapons of mass destruction. There were none. And this right here epitomizes the concern, should we have gone to the Iraqi war? I would say the number one stated cause by the U.S. government for why we went in is fears over Iraq having weapons of mass destruction. But Trump says there wasn't any. So was there any? Was there not? Let's talk about it. And he, by the way, is not a George W. Bush fan. I just want to let you know. So basically what happens is we had these two informants. One is known as the curveball, and one is a guy that this is his name, but we've never actually had a picture of him or different things like that. Each of these say that there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq starting in 1999. Well, this guy on the left is discredited immediately. He was a German asylum seeker. He stops working with the German government, and the German government lets America know he is untrustworthy. This guy is discredited by multiple other countries that say he cannot be trusted. There are no weapons of mass destruction. Eventually, I just want to point out, and this was a long time later, the one guy did eventually fabricate and say, I did lie to get out of Afghanistan or outside of Iraq, and I did lie about whether or not there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Now, regardless, though, there's a lot of controversy of whether or not we should go in. So this guy is oftentimes seen as really one of the major reasons why we go to war with Iraq. He had this massive Twitter thread last year specifically saying, while there were no weapons of mass destruction, this is why we went to war. So were there weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? No. And yet we still went to war. And if you want to go read his Twitter thread, it's about 30 tweets long. I have it all right here that you can go reference on it. But basically the concern was, when are we going to Iraq? So first is the concern over weapons of mass destruction. Then this guy, the U.S. general, ends up coming out in an interview in 2004 where he basically says, no matter what, we're going to war with Iraq. And then he later says the goal is to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off with Iran. So he basically comes out in this interview and says, we had always planned to take Iraq, no matter what the actual justification was. In the old AP test, can use tweets as outside evidence. Technically you could reference tweets if the prompt was more current, but Twitter, I believe, began in 2007-ish. And I have not seen an AP exam question really past 2000 for an essay question. But eventually one day we will. And I'm going to talk about when will this all stop because it hasn't stopped yet. So concerns about whether or not we went into war. Now, George W. Bush comes out with his autobiography, and this is his statement on the issue. The conclusion that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction was nearly a universal consensus. My predecessor believed it. Republicans and Democrats believed it. Intelligence believed it. Everybody believed it. And yes, I do agree that our future A-Push DBQs will likely be memes and tweets. I completely agree with you on that. So basically what happens is there's some controversy. This is the old Deputy Defense Secretary. And he says, for bureaucratic reasons, we wanted to go to war with Iraq, but we settle on the issue of weapons of mass destruction because that's what everybody could agree with was an issue. So regardless, though, we begin to investigate whether or not they had weapons of mass destruction. Now, this is normally when I start to hear people say, was Saddam Hussein besties with bin Laden? Depends on who you ask, although most historians will say Saddam Hussein was not behind the attacks on 9/11 because Osama bin Laden hated Saddam Hussein. So he had said multiple times that he hated Saddam Hussein, so I really don't think so. But it kind of depends on who you talk to. So regardless, though, this guy, Dick Cheney, who's the vice president of the United States, He officially declares in August of 2002, there is no doubt that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. In response to that, they begin to investigate whether or not there were weapons. So they send a UN council to Iraq to find these weapons of mass destruction. And the guy they send is a guy named Hans Blix. Well, what happens is when they send him, they find 0 weapons of mass destruction. And they officially proclaim in the spring of the next year that there are no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. America says, though, that they are hiding it. In particular, he found a wooden drone and an old bomb, and the United States said that that was enough evidence to show that they had weapons of mass destruction. They discredited that guy publicly. They said he lied and he was hiding it, and for sure, they had weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And because of that, on March 23rd of 2003, they end up officially invading and officially beginning Operation Iraqi Freedom, also known as the Iraqi War. How does that work? Well, the idea was that even if you had a vial of something to create a nuclear weapon, you have officially broken the non-weapons of mass destruction treaties. That was the idea. So, and for the record, the wooden drone is not a nuclear weapon. The pictures had never been released, but basically think of it as a wooden drone, and then it had a motorcycle engine with a propeller on it, and it could go about 100 feet in the air. And that was said to be a violation of the weapons of mass destruction treaty. So regardless, though, we enter into the Iraqi war, and this is also going to be a few months later when Saddam Hussein's statue is going to fall. And you can watch these epic videos on YouTube. I just don't want to waste everybody's time since it's taking a little bit longer than I thought. And interestingly enough, by the way, when they destroy Saddam Hussein's statue, this was actually, so this rope is connected to an American tank, and that American tank had American Marines that went up, and you can actually see them right here. They put an American flag over Saddam Hussein, and then they ended up toppling it using the tank. Once his thing had calmed down, people were dragging it through the streets, stomping on it, punching it, different things like that, showing the fall of Saddam Hussein. Now, at the same time, so if you notice Friday, May 2nd, 2003, notice the dates, only about a month after the initial, about a month and a half after the initial invasion, we say we have a victory in the war of terror and the mission has been accomplished. Now, again, just like Afghanistan, this was in May of 2003. We are still having issues in Iraq even up until today, but we officially pull out of the Iraqi war in about 2011. So regardless, though, on May 22nd of 2003, we begin to into ground troops and things like that to be able to stop the Iraqi war. In December 13th of 2003, Saddam Hussein is officially captured by the United States. This is actually how he originally looked, very disheveled, which a lot of people were very happy about because it showed the fall from grace that he ended up having. He ends up going to trial, but interestingly enough, he is not on trial for anything in the 90s or the 2000s. He goes on trial for this event, which was basically a massacre. And so what he had done is in 1982, some people had attempted to assassinate him while he was visiting this area. In response, he rounded up the entire city and shot over 190 people, including 20 people that were by accident, and he executed all these people. That's actually what he gets convicted and sentenced to death for. Is actually nothing that happened in the 90s or the 2000s, but specifically this massacre that had happened previously. So basically what happens because of that is you start to say, oh, and by the way, so Saddam Hussein is executed, just so I can have that clear. So 2 years later, we are still in Iraq. So this is going to be also another concern of what about war crimes happening with American soldiers. So this is what's called the Haditha massacre. And basically what happened is that there were 8 soldiers that were convicted of killing, I think it was 25 Iraqis. Not convicted, I should say. They were charged with it. In the end, everybody agrees to testify against everybody. All the charges are dropped except for the guy who orchestrated it. In 2009, I think it was, he ends up getting convicted. He serves 9 months in jail for falsifying information. He was originally charged with 8 counts of manslaughter, and all those charges were dropped. This becomes public, and people start to say, are we in Iraq for the right reasons, or do we have soldiers that are doing things that are bad? Now, eventually, Operation Iraqi Freedom transforms into Operation New Dawn, which is the idea of advising and training rather than directly in conflict in Iraq. And then we begin to decline our troops. And you'll notice this especially begins to decline once Osama bin Laden gets captured. But we have had a steady decline, especially once Obama declares that we're going to take all of our troops out of Iraq. On October 21st of 2011, Obama officially declares that we are going to end Iraq and pull all of our troops out, which officially results in the American flag being taken down in Baghdad in December of 2011. Now, I'm going to answer your question in just a second. So the questions that you have to really think about this is, should we have ever gone to war with Afghanistan and or Iraq? Now, in terms of general public opinion of this, so this is in Iraq, you'll notice that this begins to flip. And really when this flips is when Saddam Hussein is executed. So once Saddam Hussein is executed, you can see that it flips, and now the majority of Americans believe it was wrong to go to military force with Iraq. In terms of Afghanistan, it gets a little bit more tricky. We started with a lot more heavy right decision versus wrong. We've now kind of leveled off and come to a conclusion together. You can also see, like, for example, do you think it was successful? So maybe we were justified, but it wasn't successful. We also, the majority of Americans agree right now that we should, it's not America's responsibility to push democracy into the Afghanistan. But a lot of people also say that if we pull out, that that's a threat of safety to the United States. So you have a lot of wishy-washy in terms of both sides. To answer the question of what about American contractors, my babysitter's husband is an American contractor. So he goes over and he's a contractor over there as well. Right now we do have far fewer military members in the Middle East, but you are correct. We do have a massive increase of contractor forces, which is part of the concern over some recent war crimes and things like that revolving contractors. So anyways, that's it, which I apologize that went super long. I kind of had to condense the entire Middle Eastern history, which is like a college class, into like an hour and a half. And I apologize that took a little bit longer than I expected it. But anyways, so that is it in terms of the curriculum and different things like that. Next class, we're going to go more into foreign policy and stuff. Question, do we have a quiz for this lecture?